Привет, I'm Chuck Olinik. I'm a Ukrainian-American. I was baptized with the name Yaroslav, and that's the name I use in the historical reenactment organization, the Society for Creative Anachronism. And so in joining the organization, I settled into having an Eastern European persona, which was not really difficult because I grew up speaking Ukrainian in the house. And I started researching a lot about Slavic history and Slavic folklore. And one of the things that I noticed was a lot of inconsistencies, where you might have, for instance, Misets might be a goddess of the moon who is married to the sun god, Dashbok, or it might be the bald-headed uncle of the sun god. Okay, so pretty inconsistent stuff. And I started really thinking about this lately, going, why are there all the inconsistencies? Compared to Roman mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology. And then I started thinking about the land area that these myths originated in. You know, Greece, the Greek peninsula, not all that big, and when you compare it to the rest of Europe. You know, Rome, the original Italian boot, not all that big. And then you start looking at the Slavic region. Oh, let's see. An area that goes from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea, from the Black Sea to the Adriatic Sea. There's 3 language families or language groups within, the Slavic languages. You've also got easily a dozen different languages. And when you start looking at the myths, there are regional differences. So I thought I would throw that in case, you start getting confused. What I'm doing here is, this is going to be the 5th installment on what I call Tales of the Borderland. Sometimes I mess up, I say Tales of the Borderlands, plural. Sometimes it's Tales from the Borderlands, because I'm still working out in conditioning my brain to stick with this one title. And the reason I chose that title is the Borderland was basically a translation of Ukraine. So here we are, 5th installment. I'm looking at different gods that are, or that were worshipped on the old Kiev Hill, that Volodymyr the Great, Prince Volodymyr, later Saint Volodymyr, when he converts, he erected 7 idols. I was messing up at times and I was saying 6, but I'm not good at math, which is why I taught history. So what we're doing now is we're going to take a look at the god Veles or Volos, and there's a whole bunch of different versions of his name. There's also a lot of differences in the story of Veles. He's a major Slavic god of earth and waters and the underworld, and he's lurking beneath the world tree, because the Slavs believed in a world tree, just like the Norse did, beneath stone in his earthy kingdom, in order to control the horned beasts. There were sacrifices of cocks made to him and of human infants along certain stretches of water where Veles was known to pretty much hang out. He regularly sent spirits of the dead into the living world as his heralds. And there were festivals in honor of him held near the end of the year, in winter, when basically the time's coming for the very end of world order and chaos is growing stronger, and the borders between the worlds of the living and the dead are fading. Ancestral spirits are starting to walk amongst the living. So this has to do with the Great Night. It's kind of hanging around in remnants. uh, for in a festival that's found in a number of Slavic countries called Koleda. And this would happen anywhere between Christmas and the end of February. And it's kind of like a cross between Carnival and Halloween. And it's done near the end of the year. And, well, Christmas, February, right? End of the year. And this is when the borders between the lands of the living and the lands of the dead are fading. There's a lot of references to magic. One of the expressions that was used was weaving wool, or weaving black wool in particular. And there was supposed to be, connotations of all this magical stuff. And in some of the Koleda songs that are surviving, Koledari, these are the young men who are dressed in long coats of black sheep's wool, and they're wearing grotesque masks. What they would do is they would travel around a village or from village to village, and they're making a lot of noise. And they're singing these Koleda songs, and there's allusions to they've traveled a long way and they're wet and muddy. Well, that's kind of hinting that they came from the underworld, where Veles's underworld is wet and muddy, all right? It's underground. And they are showing up as like ghosts of the dead. So they're going to knock on a door, and the master of the house, whoever it is going to let them in. He's going to give them with gifts. And then what the Koledari are supposed to do, because Veles is also a god of magic and wealth, what they're supposed to do is they take the gifts, it's believed they would pass the gifts on to Veles. So it's kind of like a dragon hoarding wealth, and that Veles would provide good fortune. Give Veles gifts, hey, good fortune's coming your way. But if you don't, bad things can happen. Because Veles is kind of like he is a trickster god. So he's kind of got a bit of Hermes in him. He's also got a bit of Loki in him. And like them, he's connected with magic. And there's a root word that is... it means sorcerer. It's kind of connected to his name. Also, he's connected to music. He's a god who is a patron of music. And in the Tale of Ihor's campaign, there's a reference to the character of Boyan the wizard, who is also a singer, and that he is Veles's grandson. And that music thing, Veles is also believed to be the protector of traveling musicians. All right, here's a custom that kind of gives you that connection with the music and Veles. In some wedding ceremonies that were in like northern Croatia, and they were doing this up until the 20th century, the music or the musicians are not going to start playing until the groom takes some wine and he spills it preferably at the base of the nearest tree. It's kind of like he's giving it to Veles. And only at that point do the musicians start performing. All right, so if Veles is a protector of musicians, he's also a divine protector of poetry and also of oracles. He's also got a connection with wealth and trade. He protects those too. And if you're going to have a successful harvest, okay, that kind of means you're going to be giving something up to Veles. So amongst a lot of Slavic nations, there was a harvest custom of cutting the first ear of corn or of wheat, and you're weaving it into an amulet, and that was supposed to protect the harvest from evil spirits, and it could be called Veles's beard, or there was a reference to tying the beard of Veles, and that indicates that Veles was pictured as having a beard. However, since he's also in charge of cattle, he'd have horns. Gee, I wonder where that's going to be going. So there were expressions of if you got a fistful of beard, that was supposed to mean that you got really lucky and you're getting really wealthy. All right, so here's another ritual that has to do with fighting off bad stuff. In this case, if disease ends up hitting the farm animals, what the owner was supposed to do was tie a sheep, a cow, and a horse together by their tails. I'm going to assume they use some rope to kind of extend that out. And then they would get chased off into a ravine. And if they survived the fall, they got finished off with boulders. And this actually continued into the era of Christianity. Okay, so now we got to kind of get into Slavic dualism. And why gods fight, and that's kind of connected to the idea that the Slavs, just like the Norse, believed in a world tree. And it's this vast tree. Typically, it was an oak, and the top of the world tree, you can see that at night, assuming it's not cloudy. That's the North Star. For my friends in the Southern Hemisphere, I apologize. All right, and the North Star, Polaris, that's Perun's eye. Well, the branches and the trunk, that's basically the realms of the gods and of mortals. Perun sits at the top of the world tree in the shape of an eagle, and he keeps his eagle eye on the happenings of the world. And Veles, well, he's down below, which is actually kind of weird because I'll mention why he's technically not down below, but they put him there. He's down below at the base of the tree, and he, being a trickster god, he can shapeshift. So he's transformed himself into this serpent, although sometimes he's depicted as a serpent's body, but the upper portion is like a man. He's bearded, and he's got the horns. All right, there's that cattle thing again. And he's kind of just coiled around the base of the world tree. And it's really not supposed to be a bad place. It's supposed to be, I guess you end up going to an island that's across the sea or over the water, and that becomes a phrase that people use for dying, is traveling over the water. And if that's also where you're watching the birds leaving for the winter and they're going over the water. And when they come back, or when someone lives, they're coming from the water, or from over the water. And so here's Veles, coiled up down there. And he and Perun, they have this weird sort of relationship. In some versions, again, it depends on which Slavic area you go into, Veles is the chief counselor to Perun, the god of thunder and of war and of law and justice and like a whole bunch of other stuff. In other cases, they are in opposition to each other. And this dualism thing is a lot like the relationship between Chernobog and Bielobog, the gods that were only written about in like maybe the 12th century, that probably weren't actually real gods, but creations of a monk. And so at times, what they do is they get into this horrible fight. Veles, now we're back to Veles and Perun. Veles slithers up the world tree and he steals something. And it could be Perun's wife, although some versions say that actually they share the wife, and part of the year she lives with Perun and part of the year she lives with Veles. And he could be stealing Perun's children. He could be stealing Perun's cattle because, hey, Veles is a god of cattle. He wants the cattle down there with him. Or he could be attempting to steal one of the golden apples. In Slavic mythology, there were golden apple trees, and the golden apples represented like the ultimate magical talisman for destruction. And what ends up happening is Perun chases Veles and he hurls lightning bolts at him, either shooting them with his flaming bow or maybe he's launching them off of his axe, which returns to his hand magically. And it's this chase that takes place. And Veles dodges. Well, what he does is he ends up being a shapeshifter. He transforms into various animals, and he transforms into people, and he hides behind rocks and trees, and he hides behind houses and peasant huts. And wherever the lightning strikes, oak trees are going to grow, or you find these fossilized remains, belemnites, anything like that. Now, if Veles is successful for a while, there's a drought. If Veles loses and he basically says, here, take it, this is seen as, rain coming in. Yay, Perun won. Sometimes Veles just gives up. Sometimes it's considered that Veles goes through a death, but he's coming back. So it's kind of like a ritual thing. And think in terms of a snake shedding its skin. Well, Veles sometimes is a serpent. So this Slavic dualism thing, the Slavs, before they became Christians, they weren't looking at this as good and evil, and Perun is good, and Veles must be bad, because, hey, Veles has horns, and he's in the underworld, and, bad stuff from there. That's not the way the Slavs saw it. They saw it as two forces of nature that were in conflict. And they got to watch this all the time, right? As far as, especially in agricultural communities, you're watching the change of the seasons. There's all that stuff happening. So sometimes what's going to happen is, in some versions, Veles ends up, while he's healing up or sulking, he just unleashes the spirits of the dead into the world of the living. And he does that just to annoy Perun to no end. And Perun has to go after them and herd them together and shove them back down into the underworld. And it's kind of like, okay, the borders between the lands of the living and the lands of the dead are kind of blurred. And it's kind of a Halloween, All Saints Day type thing. And that actually echoes something that's in the Baltic lands. The Lithuanians and the Latvians, they believed that Veles, whom they called Velinus, would lead the wild hunt. On certain nights, a bunch of spirits would rise up out of the land of the dead, and they're flying across the sky, and they would scare ordinary folks, thinking that their souls might be taken. Especially, it's really good on a windy night to picture someone's soul being ripped from their body to join the wild hunt. But they're inviting witches and sorcerers, hey, come join us, come hang out, and they go on this otherworldly journey. So, in some ways, Veles or Velinus can be associated with the dead or the hanged, whom I guess would be dead. All right, so that takes care of Veles, one of the 7 gods up on the hill. And, in Old Kiev, I'm going to be looking at Dajbog, the sun god, next, and try to maybe herd some of the smaller gods into that too. So I hope you stick with me on my journey.